Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for signing in. We are just going to give it a minute or two to let people get settled, and we will get started. Hello to everyone just signing in. We're going to give everyone a minute or two to get connected, and we'll get started very soon. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special fireside chat on the impact of academic continuity and enrollment and instruction. My name is Kim Opelt. I am the Director of Community and Advocacy here at CLAS, and I am going to be your host today. Our focus today is really going to be focused on our discussion, but before we begin, I just wanted to give you a couple of quick reminders and a few pieces of information that we'd like to cover. So first, a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the session to send out to everyone who registered. So if you have a colleague who couldn't be here or you just want to review the information, you can definitely have that after this session. Also, we want to be sure that the conversation today is focused on the important topics that you need to thrive during this crazy time. So we want to include your voice in today's discussion, and please don't hesitate to submit any questions or comments you have throughout the whole conversation. So feel free to add questions into the Q&A box within your Zoom account. And then also feel free to interact in the chat with each other throughout the conversation too. So we want to hear from you. We want you to meet each other, and we definitely want your questions to be addressed. So type away. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that we are hoping the conversation doesn't really end right here. So feel free to keep interacting on Twitter, individually, on LinkedIn, TikTok, whatever your medium of choice. So we are all in this together, and we really just want to help keep the momentum going. So before we jump into the conversation, I just wanted to share a little bit about CLAS for those of you who might be joining us for the first time today. So founded in the midst of a pandemic, CLAS was started because we really saw a gap in the current virtual learning environments, and we wanted to help colleges and universities just like you thrive. So our virtual classroom platform really makes it easier to build those meaningful relationships with the students that you serve, whether your students are on campus or not. So we help faculty work more seamlessly with tools like automated attendance and delivering assessments, launching quizzes, tests, and more. In one recent example, our newly released enhanced breakout rooms are designed to allow faculty to see all students in their breakout rooms at one time. It also allows them to launch resources like videos or quizzes to individual breakout rooms, and even monitor individual breakout chats. So with these features, faculty can really spend less time managing their technology and more time focused on the important teaching concepts they need to get across. So we also really give access to the data that you need to make those smart decisions and to pivot quickly, which is something that we're all pretty familiar with these days. I could go on and on about all of these features, but feel free to visit class.com for a little overview or to connect with us for more information. So I am beyond excited and honored to introduce Jeff Selingo as our fireside chat guest for today. So I'm sure you are familiar with Jeff as an award-winning journalist and author, and also in his work of really shaping the future of education as a special advisor and professor at ASU, where he was the founding director of the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leadership. We are so proud to have Jeff as a member of the Class Strategic Advisory Board, where he helps to inform not only the direction of class as a product, but the way virtual learning is delivered in an educational setting and business settings really worldwide. So thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we jump in, I'm just going to set the stage with a couple of facts and figures on academic continuity, since that's what our conversation is focused on today. It's really been, as you know, an interesting couple of years as we've gone back and forth between physical settings and virtual settings. And now we're even seeing the popularity of online courses thrive for students in all levels. So now that we've seen the turbulence that the pandemic can cause in higher education, especially, continuity and fluidity of learning is really important to keep students on track and to actually also keep institutions moving forward in pedagogy and in innovation. So you might be, all of you out there might be feeling the impact of the disruption on your own campus. And when students are moved between settings and their education is really disruptive, they can become disengaged. So some may drop out. They may leave to work, and some just decide to move fully online as well. So lots of changes and fluidity throughout the experience. And we're really seeing non-traditional students as the hardest hit sector when it comes to continuity. And again, you might be experiencing this on your own campus, but a lot of adult students have delayed or even canceled their plans when it comes to their education. And then another whole segment of them has decided to move fully online. So as we move forward, continuity is really going to continue to be a consideration, pandemic or not. Flexibility is something that we've all seen and experienced, and that whole flexibility setting is really going to become more and more important to students, which will also present a challenge and maybe an opportunity to institutions. So this really is a pivotal time where we need to continue to innovate to meet the changing needs of our demographics. So with that, I would love to hear from our audience really quick, and just want to launch a quick poll, and would love to hear from you on, sorry, why is that? On what is really affecting you. So what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? I'll give you just a couple seconds to do that. Okay, just a couple seconds and all right, so it looks like a couple of these challenges rise to the top, which is declining enrollment, which is going to be a big topic of today, and then also faculty burnout and staff shortages. So, I think you're not alone if you're feeling these, and it's an important conversation that we'll be having today. So, with that, I am going to stop sharing, and we'll pop up on our conversation with Jeff. So again, Jeff, thank you so much for being here today to talk about these important challenges.
It's great to be here, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's start with that topic of academic continuity and disruption. So I think maybe let's start with who has been the most successful in academic continuity in general, and why, in academic continuity and actually virtual learning as a whole, and why.
Yeah, I think that institutions that I think had their digital backbone in place before the pandemic tended to have done better in this fast pivot to remote education. And by the way, it's not just those institutions that were known for online education, right? The ASUs of the world, the WGUs of the world, the Southern New Hampshires of the world, but also those institutions that had put in place an infrastructure around academic advising, student well-being, career services, and even just the regular student services, whether that was the financial aid office or the bursar's office or anybody else on campus, that were easily able to pivot to a remote environment in terms of work, right? We tend to think of colleges and universities as institutions of higher learning, but they're also workplaces as well. So, so for example, at Georgia State, when the pandemic hit, they moved all of their financial aid advising. Normally, that financial aid advising was done by phone in some cases, but during the pandemic, the phone group they couldn't work together, right? So you couldn't have a call center like you normally would have pre-pandemic. But they actually discovered something new in that. So normally somebody would call up the financial aid office and they would just have to wait online. Now students were able, because of the pandemic, students were able to either leave a message or type a message in saying what they needed, and then the appropriate person would call them back. So they actually knew the problem before the student ended up on the phone. And now what's happened is at Georgia State, they're now rethinking how they actually deliver those services. Isn't it much better, instead of having students wait in line, whether that's in real person, virtually, or on the phone, isn't it better if we knew what question they were trying to get? So I think those institutions that had those processes in place, particularly in a virtual environment before the pandemic, were able to make that shift much more easily, both in the classroom and outside the classroom.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, on that topic as well, what really needs to change for, maybe those institutions that weren't set up right, maybe those that were on their way and had to pivot, but what needs to change as others integrate more flexibility? And then how can leaders, especially the leaders who are watching today, continue that momentum?
Yeah, I think you're right using that word flexibility, because what I found in my research over the last 18 months is, although many students gave low marks to online education during the pandemic, if you looked at surveys, most presidents told me, well, our students really want to be back on campus. I think what you're seeing, though, is that they don't want to dispense with the flexibility that accompanied their virtual college experience. So students of all ages, I think, are increasingly accustomed to a world outside of higher education where they toggle between face-to-face experiences as well as in face-to-face experiences as well as online experiences. So for example, when we shop, we're able to choose whether we want something delivered, whether we're going to go into a store, or whether we want to pick even something up curbside. And in many ways, learners, I think, expect the same in their student experience in college. So really, institutions need to be much more accommodating and retain the mix of digital or hybrid services they adopted during the pandemic, especially where they resulted in more flexibility for students and, by extension, I think, better engagement. So many colleges, for example, are now testing out technologies to give more students control over how they want to attend classes or access advising. So we've seen Ivy Tech, for example, community college in Indiana, now where students can choose to attend in-person or virtual classes on any given day in one of a set of courses that they're offering. They're not offering that option for every single course, but they're offering some students, and especially in their bigger courses, this option to attend in person or virtually. We're seeing this, Kim, particularly around one of the easiest low-hanging fruit, I think, is around student advising and around particularly office hours. We know the best thing for engagement, particularly for retention and eventually graduation rates, is that students get to know professors their first semester in college. And we saw during the pandemic that, or even before I should say before the pandemic, we saw fewer students taking advantage of office hours, particularly first generation students, students of color, students who didn't have a lot of experience in higher education. I will tell you that's even frightening for somebody who went through college and used to work at the Chronicle of Higher Education to go knock on that professor's door when it would be closed, right? And so office hours were underutilized extensively. And we know, again, that's something that leads to student success. Well, it's much easier to do office hours virtually. It's less intimidating for students, but more than that, it's easy to work around their work schedule or their home schedule to have those office hours. That's a piece of low-hanging fruit in terms of encouraging professors, giving them the tools to do virtual office hours in a bigger way after the pandemic.
Right. And part of that as leaders, I think, is giving permission and then also modeling those things, right?
Yeah, I think, Kim, the thing that I want to stick out coming out of the pandemic is this idea of flexibility and hybridization. Because I feel like so much of the conversation in higher ed is really bifurcated around and really binary around this idea of in person or face to face.
Mhm.
And I think what we saw during the last 18 months is what is of high value that actually needs to be delivered face to face, and what can be done in a virtual environment and really have high impact in a virtual environment. And I think that as colleges and universities come back from the pandemic, one of the things I hope they do is almost take an ethnographic study of a student, right? And walk through the student experience before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now, and put yourself in those shoes and say, okay, what are the experiences that students are having on campus that really need to be done in person? And we need to return to that permanently going forward. What are those things that they really enjoyed having online? What are some classes that can be done better online than face to face? And more from an academic continuity standpoint. One thing I worry about, Kim, this is I don't think this is our last pandemic, right? We know, I mean, it's interesting. Many of the colleges that I've spoken to over the last 18 months that were better prepared, this goes back to your first question about being better prepared, were those that were in places where they had been disrupted in the past. Hurricane,
Right.
institutions in Florida and Louisiana and Texas that have been impacted by hurricanes or wildfires out west. They were kind of ready for this because they had to switch on a dime in the past because of those things. And we're going to start to see that, I think, in a bigger way going forward in higher ed.
Right. Absolutely. And Ray submitted a question. I'm going to build on it just a little bit as he asked about defining academic continuity. I think we've been talking about the concept of academic continuity in terms of the pandemic so much, but it's actually something we've been doing, or some institutions at least have been doing for years. And as we move forward, kind of, how do you think we'll redefine that concept of continuity and being able to kind of ebb and flow between in-person and virtual settings?
Well, and I think that's the thing that, as you mentioned at the top, I work I do some work for ASU, and they have really thought about this platform that they have of learning that you could kind of plug and play given the circumstances of you as a student or given the circumstances of the institution. So you could attend in person, you could attend online, you could attend in a hybrid way. And we have to think more about that going forward. Do we have the flexibility to provide that? Going back to that Ivy Tech example, do we have the flexibility to be able to allow students on any given day to approach their classes in an online environment or in a face-to-face environment? And I think to some college leaders that I talk to, deans and faculty members as well, that sounds like a nightmare, right? Like I have enough trouble to, and going back to your poll originally, right? The stress level that's on colleges and universities. I'm not saying we have to do this overnight, right? It took obviously years for the pandemic to come. It may take years for the next pandemic or wildfires or whatever it might be. I think now let's start planning for that next disruption. Let's talk about how we design our classes. Could we design our classes in a way that they could be designed to be online or in person? A lot of this comes back to the design of our classes and the pedagogy and how we choose to teach. And again, I don't think I think the stress we're seeing right now in faculty members that I talk to is they feel like everything has to be done today. And I get it. There's a lot of pressure right now around enrollment. This fall has not turned out to be as we expected because of the Delta variant. But what we should be looking for is how can we start to prepare for the longer term, for the next pandemic or the next wildfire. So if I were institutions, I'd be putting together that academic continuity task force to be thinking about this so that we're not planning for next semester, but we're really planning for a couple of semesters now for whatever's next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Karen also asked a follow-up question to that is, she says, I expect that students and faculty who have had choices in online, hybrid, high flex learning will be resistant to having that taken away. So, maybe that the staff and campus leaders feel differently, but what do you see as the future of flexibility, and will we ever really go back to, a defined in-person formal setting?
Well, I think some institutions will, because they believe that's part of their mission. They believe that is their unique selling proposition. But the problem is that before the pandemic, the quote unquote unique selling proposition of thousands of universities was that residential in-person experience, residential and or in-person experience, right? And to me, that's not unique if everyone's doing it. And what was unique about it was that we were selling the idea of an in-person experience at a particular location. And once you take that away, that particular location and in person, to be honest with you, a lot of colleges, Econ 101 or philosophy class looks the same online. And so now the question is, how do you differentiate your online component, right? You talk a lot about what you're trying to do at class in terms of engagement, right? Because if everyone just goes on Zoom, then you get into this proposition of parents and students complaining about Zoom U and why are you charging me all this for Zoom U when it's not really that engaging? Well,
Right.
how do you make that more engaging so that the online experience is just as good or even better, I think, in some cases, than the in-person experience? That to me should be what a class of institutions should be looking for. Like, what is our unique selling proposition going forward? Could we offer an incredibly good online experience? Maybe not in every course, maybe not in every discipline, but what if we were able to do a couple of disciplines in this way? Could we attract a new class of students that we would have never attracted before? I think one of the things that worries college leaders that I talk to is this idea that's out there of personalization and individualization. I actually want to talk differently about those things. I think there's a difference between individualization and personalization. Personalization to me means it's not individualized to me and you. Like, I don't have an individual pathway and you have an individual pathway. Personalization means you may have a couple of different pathways. We might offer options for online. That might be one personalization. We might offer options for a hybrid. We might offer options for a 3-year degree, whatever they may be. Maybe we offer 6 different products or 4 different products. And that to me is the personalization that students are looking for, because increasingly before the pandemic, again, everybody offered one size fits all. Here's the way you come through our institution. You enter at this point, you exit at this point, you go for 15 weeks, you take a couple of weeks off. There wasn't a lot of personalization around that. Could we offer a couple of other different pathways through to the degree in order to attract more students?
Yeah. Absolutely. And kind of digging into the nuts and bolts of that, differentiated experience between online and in person, and, might even depend on the type of institution they're at. But Ben asks, what are the topics and conditions for which online pedagogy may be better in person, and what might be better in a virtual setting? Obviously, aside from student location.
Yeah, I think that what you're really looking for is, first of all, who are your students, right? So, one of the you asked about institutions that we're doing now. Indian River State College down in Florida had built, again, because of hurricanes where they're located, they had built kind of this digital first idea early on, but then they also realized that many of their students were working and taking classes between jobs or after jobs. And so they also moved to a mobile first option, right? So not only, maybe many of us are on desktops today, sitting at our desk in our office, but that's not how many of their students were taking classes. And so they started to think of that mobile first option right at the beginning. And I think in terms of how we design our classes, I think we have to start with the student segment that the student segments we are serving or that we want to serve. What are the students and what do they need? And then design around those needs. I think too often in higher ed, we think around design of courses and pedagogy around, well, what are other professors doing in my field at other universities? Well, that might be all fine and good, but those other universities may be serving a different class of students. I'm really a big fan of this idea of student segmentation and really thinking about who are we serving now that we want to go deeper into, and who are we not serving that we think we have a selection of courses or disciplines that would be appealing to them, and how do we serve those? That's what we should be designing around, rather than just copying what the institution down the street is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that we'll start to see institutions maybe start to maybe bring in new segmentations or explore new segments or opportunities in their student populations?
I think that there will be an option for institutions to really be thinking about, for example, the adult student population is kind of the shiny object for a lot of institutions, particularly at a time, again, going back to your poll, declining enrollments. Well, where are those declining enrollments happening? They're largely happening around the traditional, or you really should say the non-traditional, age 18 to 22-year-olds. I've had talks with many presidents, deans, faculty members, trustees who really want to attract the adult student market, which, by the way, is huge. When you think about the tens of millions of people who've had college experience and don't have a degree, the millions of students who never went to college at all, but even the millions of students who have a college education and now need to be upskilled and reskilled, what do we need to offer to them? We don't need to do everything, because we're not going to attract every single one of them. But what should we be offering, for example, to bring our alums back who might be willing to pay for a micro certificate because they need a job next week that teaches them digital visualization, for example? Or maybe there is employers we're working with in our area who have a lot of employees who have 2-year degrees and may need 4-year degrees. What can we offer to them? Those are the types of segments that I think we can grow and think about beyond that traditional group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think about, those students that are either here or, coming back from a micro-credential, or that are coming to college for the first time, either as an adult or as a traditional 18-year-old? Are they lacking any digital fluencies? And same question as Ray asked for faculty. Are we missing something here? Are we, obviously we've developed a lot of those competencies over the past year, but what are we missing? What have we built? And then where do we need to go maybe in those areas?
Yeah, a lot of the work that I've done over the last 18 months is we're moving to a skills-based economy when we think about hiring. I mean, one of the jobs to be done in college is to prepare students for life after college. Most students, whether we like it or not, most learners come to college because they want a job, or if they have a job, they want a better job. And so they come to education to get that. And what are the skills that they need to learn? And a piece of the skill set is around digital fluency that many don't have. And so we shouldn't just assume that coming into college. One of the things that I've been really interested in, Kim, are colleges that have been really increasing the number of summer or pre-college programs for students before they step on campus. So that, for example, you could do those digital fluency classes over the summer, even online, in a way so that students come prepared when they show up on campus. We're seeing this particularly with students moving out of their senior year of high school, traditional students moving out of their senior year of high school into freshman year. Most colleges don't have robust summer programs anyway. They don't really sell out those programs in terms of enrollment. Could we create, I've seen a number of colleges, particularly during COVID, because they wanted to increase retention, they wanted to have less summer melt of those students, they started these summer courses, these 1-credit summer courses, which counted towards obviously their overall credits. And they've seen these students be much more engaged, but it also gives them a chance to essentially extend orientation around different topics, including digital literacy. So we shouldn't, just like we shouldn't assume faculty are ready for this, neither are students. We shouldn't assume that because this generation are digital natives that they're ready for what they're going to face in college. And I think that's particularly around how students learn. This is, again, where I think colleges could be really helpful. Most students come out of high school, or even most of us who are later in life, and we don't really understand how we learn. So, we all learn in different ways. Could we help students understand different learning styles, understand where they need to upskill around those learning styles, for example, around digital literacy. Those are the types of things that I think colleges could do before students even step foot on campus, whether that's virtually or in person.
Right, absolutely. And I think, doing things like that to really give students a head start or level set them is going to impact engagement. And engagement is something that you mentioned earlier that is really important to us at class as well. In the way we measure engagement in a typical face-to-face classroom, maybe it's a little bit more qualitatively than quantitatively, is not the way we measure engagement in a virtual setting. So Tim asks, what are the markers of better engagement going forward, probably both in a virtual and a physical environment?
Yeah, and I think that the big markers are do faculty really know their students well, and do students know their faculty well? I think that during the pandemic, I think we've seen actually faculty knowing their students better in better ways. For example, I've talked to a lot of faculty members who really didn't understand the lived experiences of their students coming into the pandemic, and they have a much better understanding. I think this is one of the things that Zoom has helped us with, that we are actually able to see the environments and get to know our students more as individuals during the pandemic. And I hope that helps afterwards, because again, we know that even simply knowing your student's name and situation in a class really does increase engagement. But then I think a lot of this is around data. And this is where, again, online learning tools really help faculty understand the data. Now, I think before the pandemic, I will classify faculty that I've talked to and worked with over the years in three different buckets, right? There was early movers who really had adopted online education. There were a group in the middle that were kind of agnostic about it. And then there was a group that said, never, I'm never going to go online. And of course, during the pandemic, a lot of people did. They were forced to go online. And what I've seen from faculty around the data piece of this is, oh, I didn't realize that I had access to all of this data. Now, for most people, it's overwhelming, right? When I look at a dashboard of any learning management system or any piece of education technology, I'm a little overwhelmed at first about what I can see on the other side. So Kim, I got a demonstration of class when we were out together at the ASU GSV conference. And having somebody walk me through that, if I'm sitting as a faculty member, is much more helpful than somebody just throwing all this data on a dashboard to me and say, figure it out. Because for the most part, for a faculty member, they can't figure it out. They don't have enough time. They don't really know what means the most to you, right? Around student engagement. This is, again, where a teaching and learning center, I think, can be really helpful to a faculty member. When you're thrown all this data at you as a faculty member, you just shut down because you say, it's just too much. Let's take it in an iterative approach. Let's say, here's what's most important. Look at this number, right? Or look at this graph. Then look at this, right? Like, get them to understand a tweak in their teaching style can actually change engagement in little ways. But the data, I think that there is a cult personality around the data among a number of administrators that I talk to, right? They think, well, we have all this data now, suddenly our problems are solved. Well, you could have all this data and if nobody ever uses it, you're never going to solve those problems. And if all you do is tell faculty, go figure it out, they're never going to want to figure it out. They have too many other things to worry about. So I think somebody walking them through this data, how it can actually change the way they approach their classroom, is going to be really important going forward.
Absolutely. And I think, in terms of that overwhelming feeling, and Alfred brought up a really good point. They work with students who are in an area of high immigration, inner city areas, but they're seeing that it's, the funding is available, the funding is there, they have devices, but it's the impact on students and training them and getting that in their hands, and just the technical support has been overwhelming. So are we seeing that in other areas as well? Is it something that is going to continue to be an issue? Is it something that is more easily addressed in areas of the pre-college seminars that you mentioned as well?
Yeah, and I think, during early on in the pandemic, as you know, I do a lot of writing, and I was getting pitched by colleges saying how they expanded their Wi-Fi to their parking lot because students were, again, in between jobs and they were trying to take their classes or do their homework in the parking lot. And isn't this great? And I was thinking, well, maybe, but is that the best learning place for a student to be taking a course is in a parking lot, right? So could we be thinking of other ways to support those students around, for example, academic advising? We talked earlier about online advising appointments so that students don't even have to come to campus. I think that as I think about the post-pandemic era that we're entering, hopefully soon, I thought we would have been here by now in terms of the post part of it. I think a critical part of this is how to make that student experience inside and outside the classroom have a lot less friction, because the most privileged students may have time and they may have the wherewithal and the know-how to navigate both the technology and the campus. But I've spent a lot of time with students during the pandemic who are first generation students who were first to their college, because I wanted to see what their experiences would be like navigating college when they couldn't get to campus. And let me tell you, it's really frustrating, right? If all of us think about our own customer service frustrations, like when you call up and they don't answer, or they hang up on you, or you have to dial like 12 numbers, or you wait in line and you never get your answer. Like, put yourself in the shoes of students on your campus. And that to me is, after the pandemic, I want every campus official out there to do that. Go through the registration process, go through a couple of classes, see where those friction points are, and let's start to talk about how we could rethink technology in those areas.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of questions are popping up about maybe student success in marketing and enrollment. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to that topic, but let's start with kind of a broad question of really, how do systems and settings and technology really play a role in the whole overarching value prop of a college or university?
I think that we have to remember that at the core of the university is teaching and learning and research, and people continue to be the core of that. Technology will never replace those people in my mind. And by the way, if all you do is take technology and place it over the way you've been always doing things, whether that's from an administrative function or a classroom teaching function, you're not going to get any better results, right? So if all we do is take Zoom or class or any other piece of technology, put it in the classroom, but the teacher or the professor continues to teach the way they've always have, continues to try to engage students the way they always have, it's never going to work. The same thing is in the administrative function, where people think, oh, I'll buy this piece of technology and suddenly we'll become so much more efficient. Well, if all you do is continue to do the work the way you always have, you're not going to be able to do that. And so I think a lot of this is around culture change and how do we encourage that on colleges and universities. I will tell you that people will say, well, the culture of our campus will definitely change after the pandemic because we've been living under this for 18 months. I will tell you that most of the faculty members that I talk to, deans and even others, they can't wait to get back to quote unquote normal, right? So I don't think you're going to have this culture change without trying to encourage it. And I think this goes back to the academic labor piece of this. Kim, going back to your poll you took earlier in this session, just around the exhaustion right now of academic labor. How do we think of academic labor in a different way going forward, right? We often talk about professors as, teaching, research, and service, right? Those are the three pillars, particularly for tenure track. Well, what about teaching and learning, and particularly with technology? What role can we do to encourage that going forward so that it doesn't fall on top of everything else that they have to do in a normal day? Could we create room in the schedule, in a professor's daily life to learn this technology in a deeper way than just to show up in the teaching and learning center and say, I have to teach a course in a couple of weeks or next semester, and I need to use this technology. Teach me how to use it. Teach me how to redesign our course. If we don't build in time in a professor's day or in a professor's schedule, and by the way, incentivize it by thinking of it just as, technology and teaching with it is just as important as teaching, research, and service, we're never going to get that culture change that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how do you, and this is kind of building on a question from Joseph, with the emergence of some campuses doing, offering MOOCs and online, courses and certificates, and especially some highly selective colleges doing this, how do more traditional colleges, smaller colleges even, get into that market, or just bring in students in a different way to not have to compete with some of those high profile campuses?
They're never going to compete, right? So what is, again, going back to this idea, is what's our unique proposition? And this is why some colleges are going to lean into the idea of residential, place-based, face-to-face education. But again, I think that that's a mistake if that's all you're going to do. One of the things the pandemic has shown us is that students want to learn with some technology. So how can we, I say, don't try to compete with the MOOCs. Is there content out there that you can use from them? Sure. But let's talk about what are the classes on our campus that should be redesigned with an eye toward online or hybrid education, right? Are there courses that we can do that? Are there entire programs that we could do? For example, a lot of institutions that have co-op programs have seen a surge in popularity in recent years. University of Cincinnati, Drexel, Northeastern, Georgia Tech. Those are really hard to embed in the curriculum, those programs. For students to work and go to school at the same time is really hard. I've been working in past with Georgia Tech, and one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we create room in the schedule for those co-ops? And one way to do it is could they take more online courses? So, for example, if they have a co-op, they could take a co-op out of town, and then maybe take more of their courses in a particular field online, rather than have to try to navigate the campus to do that. Or even if they're living on campus, they could take those courses. So I think that we have to, let's not, again, try to compete with these MOOCs, but are there programs on our campus that lend themselves more toward online or hybrid? Are there programs on our campus that we want students to get more experiential learning, whether that's at the research level or whether that's at the co-op level? And then how can we employ online education in those ways?
Right. And step one is to do that. Step two is to promote it. Right. So how would you kind of go about suggesting that campuses who may be regional or smaller, or just not, promoting those innovations that they have, how can they rise to the top?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. There's a lot of noise out there around colleges and universities right now around higher education. I think the public generally paints them with a single picture. I think that universities don't tell their stories very effectively about things that they are doing and successful students, right? People like stories, and they like stories about students who have succeeded in their classroom. I would love, coming out of this pandemic, for example, to see a lot more examples of professors who redesign their courses and tell us those stories about what they did, how they did it, what they thought about online education before and after. The same thing with students, right? Students were changed by courses that are very different now. That's how I would go about promoting it, not only to your internal audiences, other faculty members, for example, but also to your external audiences. Show us more video and audio of those students telling how they took those classes during the pandemic, faculty members who taught those classes during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And do you have any? There's definitely a demand for more exemplars. So do you have any other examples of how campuses are doing virtual learning, or even in individual courses, if there is a professor or a practice that you've seen that can be brought to an online setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think professors at Penn State, I was looking at some of those dashboards that we were talking about earlier. And again, overwhelming professors. So a simple dashboard that the Teaching and Learning Center at Penn State put together for some of their courses around allowing professors to see across all of their courses what courses generate the most questions from students. And by the way, be able to see at a moment's notice where in the course, the individual class, I should say, where those questions come up. So Penn State, I thought, has done a very good job at just, here's a way for you to simply use data that we're collecting in our course recordings. We see where students are asking most of the questions. is there a point around that core, around that piece of the section of the class that we could redesign it so that they ask fewer questions? So one example there in terms of that. And again, we're seeing this around the data that they're sharing. And I think that what interested me about the Penn State example is that they weren't, again, overwhelming the professors with the data that they're collecting. But here was one simple way for professors to say, I thought I was getting a lot of questions in that class. And by the way, it wasn't across the whole class. It was in this 1 5-minute segment. What was I teaching during that 1 5-minute segment that I could go back and redesign?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And how do we, and this is kind of going on one of Ben's questions, but how do we measure success? What metrics should we be paying attention to, maybe both, in the classroom and system-wide to determine that we are, on the right path when it comes to all of the different offerings that campuses have right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for example, Cal State has during the pandemic has come to realize that that it's really critical that not only we tend to look at term to term retention rates in terms of student success, but individual course data to see where students are failing and eyeing the time it takes students to reach their first 30 units. So California State University, for example, the system has determined that students who hit that benchmark, 30 units, within 3 terms, especially students of color, by the way, are more likely to graduate. So they know that that's the ultimate outcome, obviously, is graduation. So how do we get them to that? And what are the courses that are holding them up to getting to that first 30 units? So again, I think we tend to look at certain metrics in higher ed, retention rates, that 3rd and 5th term are key ones. What are the ones, though, that we could look at that are even earlier or that make up those term-to-term retention rates that we could start to break down the data in smaller ways, very much the way that Cal State just did?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, one more question from Stephen. I'm going to read this actually verbatim, but because of the increase in educational costs and the many problems that underprivileged youth and adults are facing, which is like the lack of high-speed internet, prices of new technologies, lack of reliable internet, all of those types of things, how could we possibly combat this in an educational sense? And what resources as an educational entity can we offer to them?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a huge problem, and I'm just thinking of the rise, for example, in campus food banks over the last couple of years because of food insecurity that we started to see from our students. I think again, it really is understanding who your students are. I think that when I started seeing the rise of food banks, for example, on campuses and talking to administrators about it, they said they never knew that food insecurity was such an issue on their campus until they started surveying students and understanding it in a way that they didn't understand before. Again, if you don't understand what your students are going through, the hurdles that they have, these lived experiences that they have, you're never going to be able to come up with these services. So you can't do it all, but what can you learn from your students in terms of what are the big issues that face them or that inhibit them from achieving student success? And by the way, there are a lot more than academic and financial. Those are 2 big pieces, but there's all these other things that are happening that unless we know them, we can't really address them.
Absolutely. And I just to wrap up, I want to wrap up on a note. We have a lot of campus leaders on the webinar today, and I want them to hear from you. What is your best advice to them as they move through this crazy time, as they kind of try to strike the balance in academic continuity and virtual courses, online courses, physical courses? What is your best advice to them? How do you encourage them to, spark innovation, keep it going, and just, impact their enrollment in a positive way?
Well, I think a big piece of this is test, deploy, pivot, right? I think what happens too much in higher education is that we tend to really test out programs, but we never end them or we never change them, even if they're not working. So I think understanding what are we trying to achieve with these programs and what is the data telling us? I think we have to better understand the students we are serving today. Do we want to continue serving them? And who are the new students that we want to serve? And what do they really need? I think we have to have a really strong idea around that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those two things in terms of student segments, but also testing and pivoting from what you normally would do in terms of your academics or your student affairs, I think is really critical. You know, Kim, so often before the pandemic, I would be visiting college campuses, and an institution would show me something that was really innovative on their campus, but it would only impact 10 or 15 students. And they never figured out how to scale it, right? So again, it goes back to, what are you trying to achieve here? If you're trying to achieve a bunch of boutique small programs, great. But if you're really trying to institute some sort of scale and change at scale, then how do you get there? I think that's, again, something that institutions really need to figure out.
Absolutely. Well, this is so much great food for thought, Jeff. It's always inspiring and informative to get to hear your perspective on so many things, and especially this really important, relevant topic. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for sharing all of your experience and expertise with our audience. I can't wait to see where we go, where our institutions go in the future, and where we go from here. So thank you for spending time with us today.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm just popping up a couple of resources for our audience. If you need any resources for continuity of learning, disruptive learning, anything in here is in this deck, and we'll definitely share this out with you. If you have any questions about class, you can find more at class.com. Go out and buy Jeff's books. As he knows, I have them all. So definitely a fan, and there's some really good information out there. So thanks again, Jeff, and we will see everyone soon.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck.